Well, welcome back to another week of this instrument. This is the last week of this instrument, so I'm gonna be going through, kind of reminding you of some of the architecture as I jump into a couple of the modes that we didn't look at last week. So last week, what we did is we looked generally over the architecture of the instrument. We looked at the three oscillator sections. We know about the mod matrix and how to map some of the LFOs and the envelopes and things to various parameters. We also looked at the filters. If you remember, we've got a dual filter system where you can have two separate filters that either run in parallel or in series, certain different filter types, etc. And obviously you can modulate them with whatever you want. The main thing that we were doing in terms of actually getting MIDI information to trigger the algorithms that we were using was either just using this touchpad, which, as you know, you can choose kind of a key layout, and I'm just going to set it to Phrygian because we already talked about that. I'm sorry. All right. But we also used, as you remember, the arpeggiator. Okay. So the arpeggiator, if I press the play button, and latch, because latch will hold things. All right. And then we can change the octaves in the arpeggiator, all those kinds of things, okay? So we're not going to use the arpeggiator so much today because what I do want to do is go in and have a look at the sequencer, because the sequencer is quite cool. There's a couple of things about the sequencer which are interesting and more fully featured than sequencers that you would usually use. There's a couple of things in there that I would love as a feature request. Hey, things, well, we'll get to it when we get to it, but things like different looping sequences of different lengths for certain parameters and things like that. If we are to go back and just remind ourselves of the different modes that there are, if I zoom in here, so if I go into just one of the oscillators, so oscillator 1 over here, let's just move this over so we can see properly. Okay, the modes that we have are wavetable, waveform, and remembering that waveform is just your kind of virtual analog. One of the coolest things about this, as we saw last week, is the kernels. So if you're using, if you're doing a saw wave, for instance, let's take off the arpeggiator and just latch a note. Really simply, we can get a super saw going. Because each one of the oscillators has up to 6, I believe, oscillators within it that you can detune. So we got some cool stuff going last week with stereo width and things. In that case, different detunings and things like that. That's the waveform. We had our wavetable. One of the things we did last week is take 2 wavetables and pan them with similar kind of movement in terms of the wavetable position, remembering that you can do things like move the wavetable directly with your finger, or you can use the dedicated position knob that shows up when you're on that page, or as we know, each oscillator has its own set of controls down here, and by default, this one here, when you're in wavetable mode, will move the position for you. What's really cool about this is you also have a travel knob. Which sets a travel through the wavetable at a certain rate. So you don't have to use one of your LFOs or your modulation sources to do that. Okay, and then that was basically it in terms of the 2 modes that we looked at. There are 3 more, so I'm going to do my very best today to dive into it. And what I want to do is start with the more complicated hard one first, whilst you're all super fresh. We're going to do some FM with the, oh gosh, you watch me stuff this up all day. Okay, so we're going to start with FM. As I mentioned last week, each oscillator can have up to 6 different oscillators within them. The Iridium calls them kernels, and this is probably the most fully featured when you're in the FM mode. And what it means is if you press these 2 buttons down here together, so we're in oscillator 1, and if I press them together, you get into what's called kernel mode, which is basically a 6 operator FM synth. okay? Just for one of the oscillators, which is awesome. So FM synthesis, I mean, hands up who's aware of FM synthesis. Most of you should be, okay? Do you know what I mean when I say operators in FM? Can someone give me a concise rundown of what that means?
They're just oscillators that can wiggle each other.
Well said. Oscillators that can wiggle each other, exactly. Okay, cool. The interesting thing about this implementation of FM, as I might have mentioned briefly last week, is that each one of these operators within one oscillator can be either just a standard sine wave, which is pretty classic FM. If we think of something like the DX7, which was around in the 80s, they were using generally just sine waves to create complexity. You can get some incredibly complex sounds just with sine waves, modulating sine waves, etc., etc. However, the cool thing about this one is that any operator can be any waveform. All right, so the complexity increases very, very quickly with this. It's a little bit menu divey in terms of getting into the guts of the FM, but I think it's worth looking at because you can get some really intense, very complex sounds quite quickly without doing things like modulating filters, etc. All right, the beauty of something like FM is that you get this kind of complexity without having all these extra things stacked on top. All right, so we're in the kernel mode. I'm just going to drone an oscillator to start with. All right, so I've just held down one of the notes. We're on a C. We should go back to Phrygian. Yes, we are in Phrygian. Very good. Okay, cool. And what we see on the first page is the algorithm. All right, this may be you may recognize this kind of layout from Ableton's operator if you've used Ableton's operator. If you jump over to, I think the global tab, I'm not sure what it's called in Ableton's operator, it has all these different Tetris-like looking configurations, and those configurations are your algorithms, okay? Basically what it's saying is it's telling you what the routing is from one oscillator to another, in this case, one kernel to another. So each one is called K1, K2, through to K6. So by default, when you open it up, we have K1 that is frequency modulating K2, okay? And you can see that we've got, if I were to zoom in just a little bit more, you can see that K2 is going directly out, okay? Let's then go and have a look at each one of these oscillators. I'm going to start with K2, which is the one that's going directly out. You can see that it is a sine wave, and if I were to zoom out just a little bit, you can see that we have a ratio over here, and we've got its level. All right, so if I were to drone that oscillator again, turning down the level, we get nothing, because that's the last thing in the chain, okay? Let's bring it back up. If we were to move its ratio, you can either move it directly in steps. So these numbers, do you know what they refer to? 1, 2, 3. Exactly, right? So this is directly aligned to the frequency of the first oscillator. So we're talking about octave up, right? Okay, so that's cool. If you press on the button, let me zoom out just a smidge. If you press on the button, it changes that to fine. So immediately we've got an inharmonic sound, okay? With FM, when you're modulating one oscillator with another, if you're modulating it at a frequency which is harmonically related, so an octave above, fifth above, whatever it is, then you're going to get sidebands that are harmonically related. In this case, this is inharmonic, all right? And then you can go to superfine and really tune that if you want to, okay? Cool. What I love about this is that you have a few different ways of choosing the ratio. You can have a ratio that is standard like this, or you can go in and say, all right, well, let's do a fixed frequency, all right? The interesting thing about that is as you move pitches, all right, I mean, it sounds like a dial tone for those of you that remember dial tones. As you move pitches, that modulator frequency stays the same, which means that the inharmonic partials is going to be different regardless of what, depending on which pitch you're using. Whereas if you were to use a ratio, even if we make it inharmonic, all right, it's always that multiplication of whatever frequency is being played. Okay, so that's one interesting way of getting that kind of variation, regardless of depending on which note you're playing. Another one which I find quite unique is a sub ratio. So instead of this being a normal ratio that is multiplied, we're dividing. All right, so if we hold down here, so these are called sub. So it's a sub ratio, but what we're doing is we're dividing. So they're subharmonics. Okay, of the frequency. All right. So that's all good. But where things get interesting with this, if I go back to ratio, where things get interesting is when you're changing the level of the modulator frequency. Okay, so that's what sounds like a sine wave is not purely a sine wave. I've gone over to K1 here, and as you remember, K1's our modulator. So if I bring K1 down, pure sine wave, okay? As I bring it up, classic FME sound, right? Let's do a fixed ratio, something inharmonic. Oh, wrong one. Hang on, whoops. K2, fixed ratio. There we go. I'm in the wrong page. There we go. Did I do something wrong? Oh, this should be ratio. My bad. Okay. Okay, so already that's something dynamic that we can work with. Well, what I might do to start with, I said that I wasn't going to use the arpeggiator, but I will. Yeah, mate.
That K1 level, that's just the volume of the first.
Exactly, right. So without that level, if we go back to the patch, the algorithm, you'll see that K2 is always going out regardless of whether or not it's got modulation. Okay, so its level determines basically the overall level of this patch at the moment. Okay, but if we go to K1 and we change its level, we're changing the inharmonic partials. Okay, so we're changing the timbre just by changing this level. All right. So if you think of this oscillating at the same frequency, but what we're doing is we're changing the modulator's amplitude, therefore we get more harmonics, sidebands.
So it's changing the depth.
Yep, exactly. They're changing the depth of modulation. All right. So at the moment when it's at 0, it's a sine wave that is flat on the 0 line. Okay. As soon as we increase that, we get sidebands. Okay, cool. Now, just like classic DX7, what I'm going to do is just add the arpeggiator here, and let's go to the arpeggio and just make it 1 octave. There we go. Each one of the this is where things get complex. Each one of the operators also has its own internal envelope. All right, so last week we looked at envelopes. The envelopes are global, right? So they're envelopes that you can map to anything. What we're hearing here is an envelope, which is the amplitude envelope, right? So if I zoom out, here's my amplitude envelope. Okay, so that's doing its thing, which is great. But if I bring that back up and go over to my oscillator, where things get super interesting is that if I go to, remember that K1 at the moment is at 0. If I go over to the envelope, you can see that each one of these operators has its own envelope. This is classic DX7 style FM synthesis. So this is just a standard envelope. It's not really doing anything because the attack is direct. There's no decay. We've got a high sustain. Okay, so you've got your what did I do? Cancel. Okay, you've got your attack, decay, and you've got multiple different stages in the envelope. So let's just jump on one. K1 decay is the first decay, and I can use this main knob over here to change that value, or I can just do it with my hand. So that's the decay. But you can see that we're not actually seeing any decay because the level, so the sustain level, if you like, at the moment, is at 100%. So let's move that down. All right, so now we've got an interesting looking envelope. Let's go back to the decay and bring this down. But at the moment we're hearing nothing. It's just a sine wave. Can anyone tell me why? Exactly, the depth is at 0. So this is modulating the level, but it's always determined by how much level is coming out. All right, so let's have a listen to it. Okay. Can we hear that? Let's bring this sustain all the way down. And we'll bring this a bit slower. Okay, so already that's an interesting thing to modulate. Oh, whoops, I'm doing the wrong one. There we go. Okay, so every time my my note hits, there's a couple of envelopes going. There's the main amplitude envelope, but then there's also the envelope of this particular one here. All right, so that's pretty cool. Awesome. What if we were to change a couple of parameters here? I might switch things up, and instead of doing an arpeggiator, I'm going to just drone things. All right. And we'll bring everything back up. There we go. And then the decay. There we go. All right. Good. Endless. Whoa, what's going on here? Let's get out of that. How do we get out of that? Maybe go to a different page. How about that? Right. Okay. Good. Now, there we go. Okay, so the envelopes are useful, but where things get really interesting is when you get out of the guts of the FM synthesis algorithm and you start to map things, and you do actually need to map things here. All right, so let's have a look at the patch. We're still going with this really simple patch. I'm going to go over to this patch section over here. All right, so you got your algorithm, and then if we go to controls, we have like a mini mod matrix here. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do is just cycle through. If you have a look, top left, top right, center, bottom left, bottom right. These refer to all of these controls over here, right, on the instrument. All right, so it allows you to map anything within the kernel algorithm to these controls, so that then they're available to tweak or to use with your global mod matrix. All right, so let's do that. So I'm going to say, all right, what's the parameter that we're mainly controlling at the moment? Exactly, level of kernel 1. All right, so we're going to make that in the center. So if I go over to the center, and I'm gonna change the name of it. I'm just gonna call it, I don't know, Bright or something, or Byte. Why not? I don't care. Byte. And then you choose what its destination is. So we say, okay, destination K1 level. Give it a macro amount. All right. Did I give it a macro?
It already hit 0 on the envelope.
There we go. If we go back. Oh, okay, interesting. Oh, because I got my sustain right down. That's why. We want the sustain right up. Thank you for that, Regan. All right, awesome. So now I've got no offset, and this knob. Okay. Simple. So if we were to go back to our arpeggiator and get going with this, we could say, all right, I could tweak that live. one thing that I could do is I could map, if we remember our mod matrix, I could map something synchronized to tempo to change this level, okay? So a useful thing to do would be to grab, say, an LFO. All right, so let's grab an LFO here. Let's do a sample and hold. Anyone remember what that is? Sample and hold? Exactly, okay. And we're going to press sync. And this is going at 16th notes, so let's make it at 16th notes as well. And then I just have to go mod targets, add, and now have a look. If we go to destination, and I go down here, zoom in so you can see. Destination. It'll be under K. Ah, there's my new value, KN1 byte. Okay. Okay, so that's super interesting. So I've got a couple of mod matrices that are working here. Let's go back now that we've got some modulation going on. You see that changing this level value, which you see up the top, changes the offset, which is cool. All right, so now let's with the envelope. Technical term, sorry. I just realized as I said it that this is going to be recorded, and this is your very professional documentation. Okay, there we go. All right. I'm going to change the global envelope here. Now I'm going to mix up some of the techniques that we learned last week. I'm going to press the FX knob. Let's turn the first one off, choose reverb, turn the gain down, darken it, make it long.
So like you can modify it directly, and then you can modify
exactly.
It
so
LFO adds to the macro.
Yeah, exactly. It's simple, right? So basically, if you see it this way, this knob that I've mapped, you see it now as like an offset. Okay, so when it's right down, there's still modulation going on, right? If we go to our mod matrix, you can see I can change how much modulation is going on with the sample and hold. I like doing a bit of reverb with this kind of thing because as soon as it gives a bit of brightness, you hear the reverb. And then this knob becomes an offset, right? So those lower values are already high. You already got some modulation. Okay, cool. All right. So that's cool.